a ball of fire coming down obliquely. A few minutes later, we heard separate, deafening crashes like peals of thunder, followed by 8 loud bangs like gunshots. A ball of fire appeared in the sky. As it approached the ground, it took a flattened shape. A flying star with a fiery tail. Its tail disappeared into the air. These are all eyewitness testimonies to the Tunguska event that took place in 1908 on June 30th, around 7 o'clock or so. And I'm not entirely sure that's how the witnesses sounded, but that's the way I felt like reading it, so it has been done. Yes. If you have not guessed, or if you did not read the title of whatever the hell I named this video, we are going to talk about the Tunguska area, but not exactly the Tunguska event. Ha! You thought I was going to discuss the Tunguska explosion, didn't you? No, we're not doing that exactly. I want to focus on something that I had no clue even existed relative to the Tunguska event. Apparently, this entire area over there in Siberia is prone to explosions like what happened in 1908. Did you know that? Did you know that there's actually other recorded explosions on the scale of the Tunguska event? Yeah, I didn't know that either, but apparently what happened in 1908 is not the first time that a huge aerial explosion has happened in that area. So, for those of you who need a quick refresher on what the Tunguska event is, this is essentially what happened. In 1908, something exploded in the area of Tunguska, and it ended up leveling almost 830 square miles of forest. And I believe they counted the amount of trees that were essentially, leveled to the ground at something like 80 million of them. Isn't that insane? Like, that's just mind-blowing. 80 million trees? Are you crazy? Do you have any idea how many geologists I could have burned at the stake with 80 million trees worth of lumber? It'd be like non-stop, it'd be like a whole brand new, we would just create like a conveyor belt of just burning geologists. Get into the fire. Oh, you're a mainstream geologist? Into the fire. There you go. I've got trees out. The Tunguska event is not just memorable because it happened relatively recently, but because it gives us a potential insight into what could possibly happen if, say, a meteorite or a comet entered our atmosphere. And that's essentially the way most people look at this. Now, one of the things that's very important to remember with respect to the Tunguska event is that at the end of the day, we still have no proof what exactly exploded over there in 1908. Now that sounds crazy because you would think that, hey, if it's a meteorite, we would find some sort of debris probably. The weird thing is that no debris has been found that can be actually attributed to this particular event in that area. So that's weird in and of itself. And of course, the mainstream will also have the commentary supporters. And of course, mainstream is still stuck on the dirty snowball situation. So these people still believe that it's like a giant snowball with some dust on it that, flew into our atmosphere and magically exploded. And that's why there's no debris. Right? We know for a fact nowadays that the dirty snowball theory is garbage. NASA has proven that wrong themselves on multiple occasions now. So the commentary body one gets, well, at least relative to how the mainstream looks at the commentary body situation, that theory is pretty much trash. Now, the meteorite one, I'm not going to say isn't true because I have no idea. But, it's very interesting that we haven't found any debris. You would think you'd find something. Now, the meteorite or cometary theory is not the only theory that exists. There's a few others out there, and I didn't even realize that people were pursuing this particular one, but there is actually a serious group of people that believes that, hey, this may have been an extraterrestrial craft of some sort. And it was, cruising along and it exploded over Tunguska. And of course, we run into the same problem with the craft theory as we do with the meteorite theory, and that is, once again, there's no debris. Now, I realize that there's a couple of people out there that claim to have debris. It's hard to be like, yeah, okay, cool, bro, I totally believe you, because the reality is we don't have the science to substantiate any of those claims. And the one piece of debris that I did see that somebody tried to present of this supposed spacecraft, it didn't, I don't know what a spacecraft debris would technically look like, but it looked like just a black chunk of rocks. So I don't know, right? That's the only thing I've seen. I'm not saying that there isn't more out there, because I haven't really dove into that side of the theory. I didn't even realize that there was a spaceship theory up until about a few years ago. So anyway, it doesn't matter. The main point here is that we have a real mystery over here in the Tunguska area. What I found even more fascinating when I started to look into the Tunguska event even more was that the Tunguska event that took place in 1908 is not the first explosion like this that has happened in the general vicinity. And the general vicinity is going to be an important thing to remember when we talk about this, because while the Tunguska event, obviously happened in a very focused area, it certainly seems like this kind of an explosive event has been an uncommon situation over the past at least 800 years. Now, the Tunguska event is obviously going to be interesting to anybody who right now is looking into catastrophes to explain a lot of the stuff that we currently see on Earth, or essentially almost everything we see on Earth if we really want to get down to it. So, something like a giant explosion, relatively recently that we can go and at least see the evidence of is pretty dang important from that perspective. Which actually brings me to the last major theory that I'm aware of that has any potential real credence, and that would be from the plasma physics community. So right now there's a good possibility that perhaps what happened over the Tunguska area was a plasma explosion generated by, something. Like, I don't know what the hell generated it, but there's all kinds of, stuff going on in the Earth's atmosphere. If we're being powered by a Birkeland current, there could be some sort of a discharge from the ionosphere down to the Earth. It doesn't have, you don't need clouds for any of that stuff. That's a possibility as well. And I realize for those of you who are really hardcore into plasma physics, I'm not going into all the details. There's a lot more to it, and there's a lot more really good science to it. And I'm aware of that, so calm down, all right? Don't start getting ready to start talking crap in the comments just yet. You can talk crap in the comments about the other stuff that we are about to talk about, because the other stuff gets even crazier than this. Anyway, so there's a potential for a plasmatic event for taking place over there. And hey, you know what? Ball of plasma explodes above the forest in Tunguska, not in, over Tunguska, and it was just a byproduct of an electrical event that was going on through whatever process is currently happening. Like I said, it could have been a Birkeland current shortage. I don't know. Who knows what was going on with that? Anyway, so I acknowledge that that is a possibility as well. Now, the plasma perspective may come into play even more relative to what locals throughout history have described in the area. And this is what I want to talk about. So, while the Tunguska event itself is the more well-known situation, how many of you knew that 800 years ago, there is evidence for another huge catastrophic event in the area? Now, before we go further, let's get a layout of the Siberian area that we are talking about. So, the area around Tunguska is essentially a forested permafrost swampland. Yeah, so it's basically very, very rough terrain. Now, I don't know how developed it is nowadays, because you can go to the Tunguska area as a tourist, and people do this all the time. So I'm going to guess that at least a small chunk of the area has been conquered by people. But back in 1908, and of course further back, it was just a complete wild land, right? So all the original explorers that were trying to get to the Tunguska area, they went through hell. I mean, it was not a simple walk through a forest. These guys had to travel through muck, swamps, have to deal with mosquitoes, all kinds of crazy sicknesses. It's not a welcoming area, basically, right? So this is what people have to deal with. So this is the kind of environment that we're talking about. So it's not all that easy to study. Now, because it's not all that easy to study, this may be one of the contributing factors into why we have not potentially found any kind of wreckage if something solid did indeed explode. Whether it be a meteorite or a spaceship, doesn't matter, right? You would expect to maybe find something, but it may not be that easy to find something given the terrain, right? So this is what we're dealing with over there. So this harsh, swampy terrain is going to matter with what we are about to talk about. Apparently, if we look northeast from the Tunguska area, we find a place that is called the Valley of Death, or otherwise known as the Upper Vilyui River. And I don't know how to pronounce that, so if I'm not pronouncing it right, my bad, but I suck at that stuff, as you should all already know. Anyway, there's another section up there in this river valley that has evidence for one hell of a cataclysm that is currently estimated to have taken place around 800 years ago or so. So I'm gonna shut up now, and I'm going to just go over this piece of work that I found, and I'll read it to you guys, and I'll show you the pictures on here, because it paints a completely different possible picture about what is happening over there in Tunguska. Even more crazy, if all of these eyewitness accounts are true, and if all of these testimonies really happened, that actually goes a long way into potentially explaining an entire other aspect of human history. All right, and just bear with me. I know some of this is going to sound initially insane, but well, maybe not insane. This is just eyewitness accounts of people who live in the area, and they're just describing what they themselves have seen and interacted with, and what their ancestors also saw and interacted with. All right, I'll shut up. Let's start. Well, I'm not going to shut up. I'm going to start reading. Let's start reading. So I found this 4-part article, possibly archived at a place called bibliotechapleiades.net. And I'll leave a link in the description for you guys. There's a lot of interesting articles here that it looks like they're just collating. And if this is, you guys already know about this place, well, shut up. I didn't know about it until like a few weeks ago, all right? But what I found interesting is they had this article with respect to Tunguska and a completely different cataclysm that happened in the same area. The twist here is that the locals describe a completely different kind of event taking place. And it's not one that currently lines up with mainstream thought processes relative to the Tunguska event or any other explosion. Because the claims of the locals are, it's very crazy. All right, let's get into this. This article has 4 parts. I'll just start with part 1 and let's see where it goes time-wise. And if we have to make 2 shows, then I'll make 2 shows. It doesn't matter. Nobody watches this garbage anyways, so I'm not wasting anybody's time but my own. All right, so here's the first part of this article. In northwestern Yakutia in Siberia, in the basin of the Upper Vilyui River, there is a hard-to-reach area that bears the mark of a tremendous cataclysm that took place some 800 years ago, which toppled the entire forest cover and scattered stone fragments over hundreds of square kilometers. What's interesting about this we already have a different situation than we find in the Tunguska event problem, right? Here we have what is supposed to be debris. Yeah, very interesting. Okay. Distributed across this area are mysterious metal objects located deep underground in the permafrost. On the surface, their presence is revealed only by patches of weird vegetation. The ancient name of this area is Uliuliu Churkachek, which translates as the Valley of Death. Yeah, I know my pronunciation sucks, just bear with me, okay? For many years, the Yukot people have given a very wide berth to this remote area that has played and still plays a special, powerful role in the fate not only of civilization, but of the planet as a whole. I know you thought this was going to be a standard Tunguska video. Hell no! We're going to go full crazy here. But if this stuff is real, and, I don't have any reason to doubt these people, it paints a completely different picture of what's going on over there. Alright, let's keep going. After having systematized a large quantity of reports and material of various kinds, we decided to inform you of something that might change perceptions of the world around us and our place in it, if humanity can take heed of what is stated here. In order to provide the fullest possible picture, we have divided our account into 3 sections. The first contains the facts and eyewitness reports in the form in which they reached us, and that is what we are going to read today. The second presents the ancient legends of peoples living in this region and the epic poetry of neighboring peoples who observed strange phenomena. This is important so that you can carry out your own investigation and appreciate for yourselves every detail of the narrative. This is why I like the way this is written, because whoever wrote this did a really good job of just breaking it down at a very basic scientific level. All right, and there are a little bit of claims that these guys make, but otherwise, outside of their own personal, conclusions, the reality is everything else they present is just objective information, which, of course, is how science is supposed to be done. All right, next section.
Eyewitness reports.
The area in question can be described as a solid mass of swamps alternating with near impassable taiga covering more than 100,000 square kilometers. Some fairly curious rumors have become attached to the area regarding metal objects of unknown origin located across its expanse. In order to shed light on whatever it was that, existing barely perceptibly alongside us, gave rise to these rumors, we had to go into the ancient history of this region to discover its beliefs and legends. We managed to recreate certain elements of the local paleotoponymy, and these matched in an astonishing manner to the content of the ancient legends. Everything indicated that the legends and rumors were referring to quite specific things. In ancient times, the Valley of Death was part of a nomadic route used by the Evenk people from Bodaibo to Anibar and on the coast of the Laptev Sea. Right up until 1936, a merchant named Savinov traded on the route. When he gave up the business, the inhabitants gradually abandoned those places. Finally, the aged merchant and his granddaughter Zina decided to move to Suldukar, somewhere in the land between 2 rivers that is known as Kelduyu, which is Iron House in the local language. The old man led her to a small, slightly flattened reddish arch, where, beyond a spiral passageway, there turned out to be a number of metal chambers in which they then spent the night. Zina's grandfather told her that even in the harshest frosts, it was warm as summer in the chambers. Isn't that crazy? Like, literally, these people are saying that there are weird structures, metallic, warm structures, in the middle of nowhere. In days gone by, there were bold men among the local hunters who would sleep in these rooms. But then they began to fall seriously ill, and those who had spent several nights in a row there soon died. The Yakut said that the place was very bad, marshy, and beasts do not go there. The location of all these constructions was known only to old men who had been hunters in their youth and had often visited these places. They lived a nomadic life, and their knowledge of the peculiarities of the area, where one could go and where one could not, was a matter of vital necessity. Their descendants have adopted a settled way of life, so this knowledge from the past has been lost. At present, the only things that point to the existence of these constructions are ancient place names that have survived in part and in all manner of rumors. But each of those toponyms represents hundreds, if not thousands, of square kilometers. In 1936, alongside the Olgudak River, and Olgudak means place with a cauldron, a geologist directed by elderly natives came upon a smooth metal hemisphere, reddish in color, protruding from the ground with such a sharp edge that it, quote, cut a fingernail, unquote. The walls were about 2 centimeters thick, and it stuck out of the ground roughly a fifth of its diameter. It stood leaning over so that it was possible to ride under it on a reindeer. The geologist dispatched a description of it to Yakutsk, the regional center. In 1979, an archaeological expedition from Yakutsk attempted to find the hemisphere he had discovered. The team members had with them a guide who had seen the structure several times in his youth, but he said that the area was greatly changed, and so they failed to find anything. It must be said that in that locality, you can pass within 10 paces of something and not notice it. So earlier discoveries have been pure luck. And anybody who's ever been to a forest, right? Have you ever gone into a thick forest? Oh yeah, you can walk by bears and never know they were there, and they could be like 10 feet away from you. I have actually had that happen, all right? It's crazy. But yeah, you can easily lose stuff in just a basic forest. If you have a thick forest full of swampland and all this other crap, yeah, you ain't finding anything. Anyway, that's one of the problems. So right now, if you're wondering, well, why aren't people going out there and just finding this stuff? That's why. Nobody knows where these exact locations are. And it gets worse, and this will describe it. Here, let's keep going. Back in 1853, R. Mack, a noted explorer of the region, wrote, quote, "In Suntar," that would be a Yucat settlement, "I was told that in the upper reaches of the Vilju there is a stream called Algi Timmerbit." And Algi Timmerbit translates into the large cauldron sank. Interesting. "Flowing into the Vilju. Close to its bank, in the forest, there is a gigantic cauldron made of copper. Its size is unknown as only the rim is visible above the ground, but several trees grow within it." Unquote. The same thing was recorded by N.D. Arkhipov, a researcher into the ancient cultures of the Yakutia. Quote, "Among the population of the Vilju Basin, there is a legend from ancient times about the existence in the upper reaches of that river of bronze cauldrons or olgais. This legend deserves attention as the areas that are the supposed location of the mythical cauldrons contain several streams with the name Olgudak, and that would be cauldron stream, unquote. And here is a passage from a letter penned in 1996 by another person who visited the Valley of Death. Mikhail Korotevsky from Vladivostok wrote, quote, I was there 3 times. The first time was in 1933, when I was 10. I traveled with my father when he went there to earn some money. Then in 1937 without my father, and the last time was in 1947 as part of a group of youngsters. The Valley of Death extends along a right-hand tributary of the Vilu River. In point of fact, it is a whole chain of valleys along its floodlands. All 3 times I was there with a guide, a Yakut. We didn't go there because life was good, but because there, in the back of the beyond, you could pan for gold without the threat at the end of the season you'd be robbed or get a bullet in the back of your head. As for mysterious objects, there are probably a lot of them there. As in 3 seasons I saw 7 of those cauldrons. They all struck me as totally perplexing. For one thing, there was their size, between 6 and 9 meters in diameter. Secondly, they were made of some strange metal. Everyone has written that they were made of copper, but I'm sure it isn't copper. The thing is that even a sharpened cold chisel could not mark the cauldrons. We tried more than once. The metal doesn't break off and can't be hammered. On copper, a hammer would definitely have left noticeable dents. But this copper is covered over with a layer of some unknown material resembling emery. Yet it's not an oxidation layer and not scale. It can't be chipped or scratched either. We didn't come across shafts going down into the ground with chambers, but I did note that the vegetation around the cauldrons is anomalous, totally different from what's growing around. It's more opulent, large-leaved burdock, very long withes, strange grass, 1.5 or 2 times the height of a man. In one of the cauldrons, the whole group of us, 6 people, spent the night. We didn't sense anything bad, and we calmly left without any sort of unpleasant occurrences. Nobody fell seriously ill afterwards, except that 3 months later, one of my friends lost all of his hair. And on the left side of my head, the side I slept on, 3 small sore spots the size of match heads appeared. I've tried to get rid of them all my life, but they are still with me today. None of our efforts to break off even a small piece from these strange cauldrons was successful. The only thing I did manage to bring away was a stone, not an ordinary one though, half of a perfect sphere, 6 centimeters in diameter. It was black in color and bore no visible signs of having been worked, yet was very smooth as if polished. I picked it up from the ground inside one of those cauldrons. I took my souvenir of Yakusha with me to the village of Samarka, where my parents were living in 1933. I was laid up with nothing to do until my grandmother decided to build a house. We needed to put glass in the windows, and there wasn't a glass cutter in the entire village. I tried scoring it with the edge of that half a stone sphere, and it turned out to cut with amazing ease. After that, my find was often used like a diamond by all our relatives and friends. In 1937, I gave the stone to my grandfather, but that autumn he was arrested and taken to Magadan, where he lived on without trial until 1968 and then died. Now, no one knows where my sphere stone got to." Unquote. Isn't that a crazy story? Now, it's funny because that story is really not insane. Like, nobody's being abducted by aliens, nobody's seeing ghosts. I mean, there's nothing really weird about it. The only thing that's extremely weird is that they're finding these half-buried cauldrons laying out there in the middle of nowhere. Even more interesting, they're finding half of a sphere the size of something you can fit in your hand. What the hell is that? Like, I've never heard of this stuff before. That's why I found this interesting. It gets even crazier. Let's keep going. In his letter, Kortesky stresses that in 1933, his Yukot guide told him that, quote, 5 or 10 years before, he had discovered several spherical cauldrons. They were absolutely round, that protruded higher than a man, out of the ground. They looked brand new. Later, the hunter had seen them again, now broken and scattered. Unquote. Kortesky also noted that when he visited one cauldron a second time, in the intervening few years that it had sunk appreciably into the ground. And that's kind of key, because right now what we're seeing is we're seeing evidence that whatever these objects are, they're currently sinking into the land. So it might be extremely difficult to find these nowadays, not because they're not real, but simply because who knows how far they've sunk. And like I said earlier, it's hard to get out into these regions. I mean, they literally call it the Valley of Death. What do you want from me? You're not going to run out there all happy and skipping, with some archaeological digging tools and be like, yeah, we're going to find a sphere. It's not happening, right? That's a pain in the butt. So, the reason why I, and maybe a lot of you have never heard of this, is for this precise reason. It's very difficult well, obviously it's going to be difficult regardless, to corroborate something like this. But at the same time, the evidence is just disappearing literally. And that's one of the problems that we have in all of history. I mean, the reality is the time that we live in right now, a lot of stuff has happened in the past before we were born, and a lot of that stuff has gone a long way into permanently destroying evidence for all kinds of cool things that we really would like to know about, right? I mean, it's like, you think about, okay, anyway. Oh, and also, this guy is literally describing potential radiation poisoning, isn't he? He has a friend that loses his hair. He himself gets 3 anomalous growths on the side of his face where he was sleeping in the cauldron, or on top of the cauldron. Or I should say, like, in the cauldron. Anyway, I don't know how he was sleeping, but the point is that the direction that his cheek was facing, it was facing the physical wall of the cauldron, and he may have gotten radiation poisoning from that. I mean, what do you think? Isn't that crazy? Then what the hell are these objects out there? It's one thing to find some kind of a crazy, cauldron in the middle of nowhere. That's one thing. And it's funny, those have actually been found, not metal, but stone cauldrons have been found all over the world, right? Huge stone cauldrons. Those are very interesting finds. But these guys are talking about untouchable metal cauldrons, indestructible metal cauldrons, and apparently they might emit radiation. Even more interesting, if that guy had a black stone, that black stone could have been a radioactive stone of some sort as well. I don't know. I don't know. Okay, let's keep going. Kortesky also noted that when he visited one cauldron a second time in the intervening few years, it had sunk appreciably into the ground. A. Gutanev and U. Mikhailovetsky, 2 researchers who lived in the town of Mirny in Yakutia, reported that in 1971, an old hunter belonging to the Evenk people had said that in the area between 2 rivers known as Nayugan Butur, which means fiery champion, and the Adadarak, which means place with a 3-sided harpoon, there is a poking out of the ground, the very thing that gave the place its name. A very big 3-faceted iron harpoon. While in the area between 2 rivers known as Kelagur, which means iron people, there is an iron burrow in which lie, quote, thin, black, one-eyed people in clothes of iron, unquote. How do you like that? What the hell is that? What do you mean thin, black, one-eyed people in clothes of iron? What do you mean that there's a three-faceted iron harpoon sticking out of the ground out in the middle of nowhere? What the hell is that? Okay. He said that he could take people there, and it was not far away, but no one believed him. In the meantime, he died. Perfect, of course. Of course, why wouldn't he die before anybody could get there, right? I hate that. One or more of these objects was, to all appearances, covered after the building of a dam on the Vilju, slightly below the Irby. According to the account of one of the builders of the Vilju hydroelectric project, when they constructed a diversion canal and drained the main channel, they discovered in it a convex metal spot. Deadlines were pressing, and after a cursory inspection of the find, the project managers gave orders for work to continue. So basically that means that those spheres are now covered in water. Even more interesting, and I wonder if we could test this, if those spheres are actually radioactive, you could probably then test the water that's now in that reservoir to see if that water's radioactive. Hell, and if people are using any of that water downstream from the dam to drink or for anything, then we should be able to trace the radiation as well. I'll have to look into that. We'll check that out later. There is a host of tales from people who come across similar constructions by accident, but without precise directions, it is extremely difficult to find these again in the depressingly monotonous terrain. Once some old men said that flowing in the place called Tong Duray is a stream called Otumak, which means holes in the ground, and that around it there are incredibly deep openings known as the, quote, the Laughing Chasms, unquote. The same name also crops up in legends that state that this is the dwelling of a fiery giant who destroys everything around. Roughly every 6 or 7 centuries, a monstrous fireball bursts out from there, and it either flies off somewhere into the distance and, judging by the chronicles and legends of other peoples, explodes there, or it explodes directly above its exit point, as a result of which the area for hundreds of kilometers around has been reduced to a scorched desert with shattered rocks. Like, what? Isn't that insane? Like, in the area when the Tunguska event happened, an event that has no debris that we can find from the explosion, we have people talking about balls of something coming out of the ground, fireballs coming out of the ground and exploding? That didn't leave debris either. See, this is the correlation. What the hell's going on over in Tunguska? Is something else entirely that we are not thinking about at all happening? Okay, let's keep going. Yakut legends contain many references to explosions, fiery whirlwinds, and blazing spheres rising into the air. And all those phenomena are somehow or other associated with the mysterious metal constructions found in the Valley of Death. Some of them are large, round, iron houses, quote unquote, standing on numerous lateral supports. They have neither windows nor doors, only a, quote, spacious manhole, unquote, at the top of the dome. Some of them have sunk almost completely into the permafrost, with only a barely noticeable arch-like protuberance remaining on the surface. Witnesses who are strangers to each other describe this resounding metal house in the same way. Other objects scattered across the area are the metallic hemispherical lids that cover something unknown. Yakut legends say that the mysterious blazing spheres are produced by a, quote, an orifice belching smoke and fire, unquote, with a, quote, banging steel lid, unquote. So basically, these spheres are opening up and releasing something, maybe. Right? I mean, that kind of sounds like what they're talking about. What the hell's happening? This is also the source for the fiery whirlwinds that, from the descriptions, sound very similar to the effects of present-day atomic explosions. Roughly a century before each explosion or series of explosions, a fast-flying, fiery sphere emerged from the iron orifice and, without causing great damage, soared upwards in the form of a thin column of fire. At the top of this, a very large fireball appeared, accompanied by 4 claps of thunder in succession. It soared to an even greater height and flew off, leaving behind a long trail of smoke and fire. Then a cannonade of its explosions sounded in the distance. In the 1950s, the Soviet military cast an eye over this area, evidently due to the exceptionally sparse population on its northern fringes, and conducted a series of atomic tests there. One of the explosions produced a great puzzle, and foreign specialists are still speculating about it. As the German radio station Deutsche Welle reported in September of 1991 that, when a 10-kilogram nuclear device was tested in 1954 for unknown reasons, the size of the explosion exceeded the calculations by a factor of 2 to 3,000, reaching 20 to 30 megatons, as was registered by seismic laboratories around the world. The cause of such a significant discrepancy in the power of the explosion remained unclear. The news agency TASS, T-A-S-S, put out an announcement that a compact hydrogen bomb had been tested in airburst conditions, but it later emerged that this was incorrect. After the tests, restricted zones were established in the area and secret work was carried out for some years. Yeah, I wonder what the government over there knows, or even the governments of the world as well, but I wonder what the Russian government has over there. I wonder if they were able to actually find this stuff and dig it up, or if they couldn't dig it up, they could figure out what it was for, if it existed. Man, that would be awesome to dig into their libraries of their secret stuff. We'll never get it. Sucks. Alright, this next section is called Myths and Legends. Let us try to look into the distant past as it is reflected in epic poetry. As the legends passed on by word of mouth testify, in the remote period when everything began, the area was inhabited by a small number of Tungus nomads. Once upon a time, their distant neighbors saw that their land was suddenly wrapped in impenetrable darkness, and the surroundings were shaken by a deafening roar. A hurricane of unseen force arose, and the land was riven by mighty blows. Lightning crossed the sky in all directions. When everything calmed down, the darkness dispersed. An unprecedented sight met the nomads' eyes. In the midst of the scorched land, glowing in the sun, stood a tall, vertical structure that was visible at a distance of many days' journey. Now, what? For a long time, the structure gave out unpleasant, ear-splitting noises and gradually diminished in height until it disappeared under the ground altogether. In place of the tall structure, there was an immense yawning vertical orifice. In the strange words of the legends, it consisted of 3 tiers of laughing chasms. Its depths supposedly contained an underground country with its own sun that was, however, waning. That's kind of like the Hollow Earth stuff a little bit, right? Or the Enoch stuff, right? Or anybody that has to deal with inner Earth, theory or stories or whatever. I mean, the reality is there are Hollow Earth legends baked into a lot of religions, right? Like Enoch's a good one. I'll just use that because everybody knows Enoch. But Enoch, especially or essentially goes down and there's a glowing sun in the middle of the earth, and that's where all the people who live inside the earth get their sun from. It's very interesting that these natives who live up there would have a story like this as well. I mean, why would they make up a sun in the middle of the earth? Like, that's a weird one. And what's even more interesting is that their story says that their sun is waning. Their sun is weakening. Yeah, it's very interesting. I wonder if something like that is true, It's funny, with respect to plasma physics and electrical universe theory, stuff like that. One of the interesting things that comes out of that theory is that Earth might actually be required to have some sort of hollowness somewhere to make that whole situation work. I'm not going to get into it, but it is interesting that the theory may actually predict some form of a hollow Earth situation. Now, I'm not saying that that's like actually true. I'm just saying that the physics behind it may desire something like. Anyway, let's move on. A choking stench rose from the orifice, and so no one settled near it. From a distance, people could sometimes see a rotating island appear above the opening, and this is then proved to be its banging lid. Those who were tempted by curiosity to take a closer look never returned. Centuries went by. Life went on as before. Nobody anticipated anything extraordinary, but one day a small earthquake occurred and the sky was pierced by a thin, fiery whirlwind. At the top of it, a dazzling fireball appeared. Accompanied by a succession of 4 thunderclaps and leaving behind a trail of fire, this sphere shot off along the shallow downward trajectory and, after vanishing beyond the horizon, exploded. The nomads were perturbed but did not abandon the lands that were home to them, since the demon had not caused them any harm, but had exploded over the lands of the hostile neighboring tribe. Yeah, nice, very nice. A few decades later, events repeated themselves. The fireball flew off in the same direction and again destroyed only their neighbors. Evidently, this demon was in some way their protector, and they began to create legends about it, calling it Nairugan Butar, or the Fiery Champion. But some time later, events occurred that horrified those in even the most distant surroundings. A gigantic fireball emerged from the opening with a deafening, thunderous roar and exploded right overhead. a tremendous earthquake ensued. Some hills were cut across by a crack more than 100 meters deep. Following the explosion, a fire-raging sea continued to swash about with a disc-like rotating island above it. The effects of the explosion extended over a radius of more than 1,000 kilometers. The nomadic tribes which survived on the edges of the land fled in different directions, seeking to distance themselves from the fatal spot. But that did not save them from death. They all succumbed to some kind of strange illness that was passed on only by inheritance. Yet they left behind them precise accounts of what had taken place, on the basis of which Yucat storytellers began to compose beautiful, exceptionally tragic legends. A little over 600 years passed. Many generations of nomads had come and gone. The precepts of the remote ancestors had been forgotten, and people again settled the area. As a side note, one of the things that is fascinating with respect to history and our understanding of it is generational knowledge. If the generations that come after the people who experienced something insane do not carry on the tradition, it's amazing how fast human psychology will absolutely wipe the slate clean. So, I mean, there's a lot of amazing stuff that we have proof of, it seems like happened on this planet, but nobody really believes it nowadays. Simply, well, there's a lot of reasons why people don't believe it, but one of the reasons is simply because it is no longer present in our lives, right? None of these stories really kept their bite. None of these stories truly carried their weight throughout the generations. So, most of us just kind of move on. We do. That's how we lose a lot of our history. Same thing here, right? 600 years pass, these amazing, insane events get completely forgotten. And why wouldn't they? The main point is that it does not take that long for history to erase itself on its own. All right, okay, anyway. Many generations of nomads had come and gone. I read all that. Then, history repeated itself. The fireball of Nayurgan Buttar appeared above a fiery whirlwind and again flew off to explode beyond the horizon. A few decades later, a second fireball rent the air. Now it is called Kayun Erbi, the gleaming aerial herald or the messenger. Then came another devastating explosion that the legends again anthropomorphized. It was given the name Uat Usumu Tong Durai, which can be roughly translated as the criminal stranger who pierced the earth and hid in the depths, destroying all around with a fiery whirlwind. What's interesting about this is that if this is the launching area of some sort of a ball of plasma, and if a ball of plasma was released in 1908 from this location and then shot over to Tunguska and exploded, right, that's another explanation of why we don't find any wreckage, and it also explains where it came from. This is a completely different version of Tunguska, and I have heard nobody talk about this. It's crazy. Alright, let's keep going. It is important to note that on the eve of the flight of the negative hero Tong Durai, there appeared in the sky the messenger of the heavenly Daisege, the champion of Kayun Erbe, who crossed the firmament as a falling star, or as dashing lightning, so as to warn Nayurgan Buttar of the coming battle. The most significant event in the legends was Tong Durai bursting forth from the underground depths and doing battle with Nayurgan Buttar. This took place roughly as follows. Quote, "Firstly, a snake-like branching fiery whirlwind burst forth from the orifice, on top of which there again appeared a fireball of gigantic size, which, after several peals of thunder, shot high into the air. He was accompanied in flight by his retinue, a swarm of fatally bloody whirlwinds that wrought havoc in the vicinity." Unquote. But there were occasions when Tong Durai encountered Nayirgan Buttar above the place where he took off, and following these, the area remained lifeless for a long time. The picture painted of these events varies quite considerably. Several fiery champions might emerge from the opening at once, fly some distance, and explode in one place. This happened with the flight of Tong Durai. A study of the soil layers indicates that the interval between explosions does not exceed 600 to 700 years. That's important. They actually have evidence for these explosions. So that's the good news. It's not just some story with no actual scientific evidence. The soil samples themselves have started to paint this picture. And of course, the topographical geological evidence is there for everybody to see as well. You can go and see the destruction. It gets even crazier because I also started reading a paper about the various kind of basalt lava flows that exist in that area on the surface. Those may have been created by these blasts, potentially. Maybe we'll talk about that in a different show, but there is legitimate evidence that melting took place over there, explosions took place over there, and it looks like people saw all of this. All right, we're almost done. We'll keep going. The legends vividly reflect these events, but the absence of a written tradition means that they have not been registered in documentary form. Yeah, I wonder how many other legends around this planet have never been written down that are only oral and that are now gone forever. We have lost so much. It seems, though, that this lacuna is compensated for by the historical chronicles of other peoples. The chronicles of other peoples. Altogether, at approximate intervals of 600 to 700 years, several explosions, or rather, a whole complex of events, including the precursors, took place. All these occurrences were painstakingly recorded in epic poetry, traditions, and legends. It is a curious fact that similar legends arose in the equatorial zone of the planet, where explosions or giant fireballs that suddenly appeared in the sky destroyed several centers of ancient civilizations. Now that's interesting. One of the things that I guarantee you these guys are not familiar with is a lot of the catastrophist stuff that has now been proven relative to other legends, right? We know that other civilizations have been wiped out by some sort of a plasma event. You know, Sodom and Gomorrah, that's a good one. So he's blaming, well, I guess it's not, well, okay, anyway, ignore me. Judging by the results of archaeological investigations carried out in the Upper Vilyuy region by S.A. Fedoseyeva, the intermittent wave-like settlement of this territory can be tracked roughly to the 4th millennium BC. And I'm sure he's using mainstream chronology, so it's probably not that old. In the 1st millennium AD, the line of historical development is interrupted. And this does not contradict the possible date for the last historical explosion as September 1380. The cloud it raised blotted out the sun over Europe for several hours. In several geoactive zones, powerful earthquakes took place. 1380. So we could potentially test some of this theory by trying to see if we can find any records around the 1380 time period that might correlate to this event. Yeah, I'll do that in a different show. That could be interesting. This event is recorded in written sources. In Russian chronicles, it coincided with the Battle of Kulikovo Field. Ah, really? The golem dispersed only in the second half of the day. A wind of such strength blew, and an arrow shot from a bow could not fly against it. That was a quote, by the way. I know, I forgot to say quote unquote. This factor made a positive contribution to the Russian victory. However, the explosions are described in Tungus legends are far more vivid than any other sources. Judging by the accounts, they were many times worse than modern nuclear weapons. If we take 1380 as our starting date and go back to the past, we can trace such moments. In 830, for example, the culture of the Mayans, who inhabited the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, was destroyed. Many of their cities were reduced to ruins by an explosion of monstrous force. Now, he's correct here. There might have been something pretty insane going on during this time period, and I will do a show on that later. I don't know if this corroborates with the event that he's talking about. It's very interesting. Okay, yeah. Some passages in the Bible are akin to the Yakut legends. The descriptions of the plagues of Egypt and the demise of Sodom and Gomorrah. Yeah, so this is what sucks about researchers. They start grabbing at random stuff when they start to get onto the trail of something. For example, this guy's not talking about Velikovsky, Venus, all the other cultures talking about Venus. He's not correlating any of that to that. So, you got to watch out for that stuff. Now, I'm not saying what I just said is 100% correct, but scientifically speaking, it's in the right direction. Now, that also does not mean that something isn't going on in the Siberian area coinciding with all of this stuff. I don't know. That's where it gets crazy. But we're going to have to dig deeper if we're going to make that kind of a correlation. All right, he goes on. In one of the oases of the Arabian Peninsula, an ancient town was destroyed and literally reduced to ashes. According to legend, this took place when a huge fireball that appeared in the sky exploded. Once again, that could be from a cosmological origin during the Venus or Mars event. Or, at Mohenjo-Daro, on the Indian subcontinent, archaeologists discovered a devastated city. The marks of the catastrophe, melted stone walls, clearly pointed to an explosion comparable with a nuclear bomb. Similar events are also described in Chinese chronicles from the 14th century. They say that far to the north, a black cloud rose above the horizon and covered half the sky, scattering large fragments of stone. Stones also dropped from the sky in Scandinavia and Germany, where fire broke out in several towns. Scholars established that they were quite ordinary stones and conjectured that a volcano had erupted somewhere. Yeah, those guys wouldn't have known what they were looking at regardless. Even if they were regular stones, they probably still couldn't have identified them. Perhaps the cause of these misfortunes really was Tong Durai, who has been bursting out from under the ground for many centuries, while Nyargan-Botr blotted out half of the sky at his appearance. Tong Durai considerably exceeded him in size and, ascending into the heavens, completely disappeared from view. We note that in the Valley of Death, a rise in the background radiation is observed at certain intervals of time, a phenomena that specialists cannot explain. That's the end of the article, and it goes on to 3 other parts, and yeah, I'll probably get into them. But what I wanted to show here at the very least was a piece of history that I had no clue existed. I had no clue who the Yakut people were, and I certainly did not know of their legends of crazy fireballs coming out of the ground and destroying things in the sky, or just exploding for fun, or whatever, right? I mean, that's crazy. Like, that's some insane stuff, but there it is. The interesting thing about all of this, the fact of their history reporting these kinds of destructions, this really does help corroborate a lot of other eyewitness testimony into the past that talk about all kinds of catastrophic events taking place. So there's some really good valuable information here. The other thing to note really fast before you start taking this and injecting it into your pet theory is that there are multiple of these events scattered over 600 to 700 year periods. So if that's a legit thing, right? If we can 100% prove that yes, it only happens in intervals, you know, that's going to be a different situation than, say, the fire erupting at random times. Because what that means is that the system might be automatic if it's doing this every 600 to 700 years versus doing it randomly when it's maybe perhaps reacting to something that is variable within Earth or outside of Earth or whatever. So it's important to note that this happens multiple times and that we could potentially expect it to happen again. All right, I'm done. We've done this for an hour. Yeah, I can't talk anymore, as you can probably tell. All right, so anyway, we'll keep going with part 2 in another show. But this stuff is fascinating, right? Have you ever heard of these spheres and Tunguska explosion being related? I hadn't. Anyway, all right, there you go.